Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Intention Act Live segment. Happy MLK Day. My name is Stephen Walker, Business and Project Manager with All Aces. And today I have a very special guest and friend of mine, Dr. Atyia Martin. And we would both just like to say hi and welcome, and thanks for being here. Dr. Martin, how are you doing today?
I am very good. I can't complain at all. Looking forward to our conversation today.
I am too. I am too. So, as everybody's making their way into the show, again, thanks for being here. Um,
You didn't time out. If we're living our values,
I was coming right to that. That's what I was
oh,
going to
okay,
say.
okay.
I got you. I got you, Dr. Martin. We have a set of values that we utilize and live here at All Laces, and one of them is called collective care. Just kind of give you a quick background on that. Collective care is just checking in to make sure that you're doing okay. So I'm gonna do my part. I'm gonna ask you, Dr. Martin, how you doing? How you feeling? How's your weekend? What's going on?
Well, as I said earlier, I am doing well. I'm excited about our conversation today. My weekend was busy. It was full in a good way. Got a chance to do a lot of work with my nonprofit, Next Leadership Development Corporation, and supporting Black residents, particularly elders and families in Boston, with wellness checks and things like that. So, in resources. So, just very happy that I can channel my energy and knowledge and skills and resources into things that are not just helpful to me and my family, but for other people too.
Right, that's awesome. Thank you. Always the good Samaritan, as always. I appreciate you.
What about you?
I can't complain. My weekend was good. I had to unfortunately watch my Ravens take an L this week, so we're gonna be sitting at home watching the rest of the NFL teams play, but that's all right. We're gonna be okay. We'll come back next year, and we'll just
Mhm.
look forward to that. I had to sit in silence for a little bit to accept what had transpired, but it's all right. Wake up and live another day. So life is good. Cannot complain.
Mhm.
So today's a very special day. It is MLK Day, otherwise known as Martin Luther King Jr. Day, and we're gonna, kind of dive right into some topics on not only his legacy, but talk a little bit about his humanity, because sometimes I think that we forget that, he's this amazing guy who had great teachings, but he was still human. And we're also going to talk about how we can incorporate his teaching and his ideals into today's society. So, if it's all right with you, we're going to get right into it and get started.
Let's go.
All right. So, uh, first thing I wanted to bring up, uh, you know, what does Martin Luther King Jr. Day mean to you? And not just the aspect of, oh, well, he was a civil rights leader and activist. I mean, how does he affect your life on a personal level in your world?
So I would separate my affection, thoughts, and feelings towards Martin Luther King Jr. from the day. The day is kind of, commercialized and obligatory, and people say all the usual stuff about, him being nonviolent and, the, his vision for let me reframe the limited aspects of his vision that people are comfortable with. And so I think there's this perception of Martin Luther King Jr., Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., that is whitewashed and just comfortable, versus the full breadth of his teachings, and what he was advocating for and how he evolved over time. So, for me personally, what I appreciate most about the man and his vision and his values is um, that he studied. He was thoughtful about it. And I don't mean that he just studied in school and they taught him all that stuff in school. I mean, it's clear he spent hours and hours and hours thinking and writing and reading so that he could frame things in a way that were informed, but also he worked hard to translate um, what were difficult concepts and ideas from
Right.
across the spectrum of philosophies and things like that into accessible language for folks, but without dumbing it down for people. And so I really appreciate that. And then the second thing I'll say is, oh, third rather, I guess in this case, I'll say is he struggled, right? Like his trajectory of his vision evolved over time, and I think we forget that, and people focus on kind of his earlier vision, which still was robust, but they miss the how he evolved from that "I have a dream" speech to
Right.
um, before his death, before his assassination, kind of how he evolved, and I'm looking forward to talking a bit more about that.
I really appreciate what you're saying about MLKD, KD kind of being whitewashed. I know growing up and when I was in school, it was essentially like it was just a holiday to be celebrated as like, oh, I don't have to go to school or I don't have to do this, instead of really being taught and
Mhm.
educated as to what his teaching was, what his beliefs were. And to your point, Dr. Martin, um, a lot of people think that Malcolm X and Dr. King had these two totally separate different ideals,
Mhm.
but they were actually more aligned than what I think some people may realize. So I really appreciate your point to that. And I'm just curious, what do you personally think that it should MLKD mean? If you could sum it up just real quick, in Dr. Martin's world, what exactly should MLK Day mean?
I think it would be an opportunity for us to reassess what our commitments, how our commitments and actions have aligned or not aligned with advancing racial equity and social justice in America. I think it would be understanding or going deeper into what his vision was and kind of the specific issues he really wanted to focus on, and kind of him. And I think the understanding like his personal and life trajectory so that people can see him as a real human being, and that what he the what he accomplished um was extraordinary. Um the actions he took are accessible, and the journey he took is accessible. And so I think being able to connect the dots to action, and being able to leverage his what we can learn from his life as an instructional tool.
Gotcha. That's amazing. Thank you for that insight. I know that's helpful for me. I know as far as what would MLK Jr. mean for me, what I think it should mean. Um, I think it's also a time of reflection because I think we kind of sometimes forget just how much he means to how things are in today's society, just from the standpoint of schools not being segregated. I mean, little things, water fountains being segregated, and sometimes we don't take enough time to remember that, and like I said, and
Mhm.
really appreciate and be mindful of just how different things were honestly not that long ago. There's people's grandparents that remember that time. You know what I mean? And sometimes the way technology moves and time moves, it goes by so fast that we kind of not necessarily forget where we came from, but it doesn't. We don't carry it as near and dear to us, as we should. So, um,
And I'll just add to that. I think I want to be measured in this because I understand the affinity we have for Martin Luther King Jr. and what was accomplished through the civil rights movement. And I want to say that Martin Luther King Jr. himself said on camera in an interview that you can go on YouTube right now and look at, his CBS interview about a year before he was assassinated, where he said we've accomplished things, and that he was happy that we were able to accomplish those things. He also acknowledged that there was a certain level of idealism and naivete that was present in the early vision, and that integration was not uh, the answer, and that we have a lot more work to do. These are his words, that we have a lot more work to do. And so I want to, in that, as we think about kind of how things have changed, there are some ways that they have stayed the same, and in some cases are worse, right? So if you go to most cities in America, they're still very segregated. Some
Right.
cities more than others, right? Like you can go to certain areas and, not really see very many, people of color in a neighborhood or in an area. If you come to Boston, like that's the joke about Boston, people who have come to the city of Boston, which is where All Aces is located, y'all. Um, you can be a tourist and go to all the tourist places and not see very many people of color because of how segregated our city is. Now, the irony in that is that Boston is more than 50% people of color. And so
Mm.
being able to kind of understand that we have gained benefits and things have evolved. And then there are other ways that they're not as blatant, not as overt, but more deeply entrenched in terms of ideas and values, and whose dignity is respected or not respected, and um, who is allowed to be who they are, and who's allowed to be in spaces, and not just allowed in terms of the rules and the laws, but in terms of how people treat us. And by us, I mean Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and I'm focusing especially on Black people's experience. So I just add that to the context as we think about kind of where we were, where we are, in that in many ways. Out in here saying in many ways, Martin Luther King Jr. was um, clear about the fact that you can't legislate love or these other things, and so I think there's definitely uh, an opportunity for that kind of nuance to be present.
That's awesome. And I'm so glad you said it because I'm actually going to come back to that point a little bit later on in the episode, just to get your thoughts on things that have changed and things that haven't really changed. I think that's something that's super important because that is something that as I take my own personal racial equity journey, I'm starting to see the little things of that. If you look at it from a distance, you're like, oh, it's not that bad. But when you kind of put a lens on it and get down to nitty gritty, you're like, whoa, whoa, wait a minute, so that's not right. So I really appreciate you bringing that up. And like I said, we're going to come back to that.
Mhm.
So I have a question for you. What does MLK mean in today's society in terms of blackness? And here's let me try to put some context to that question for everybody that's watching and listening. Um, Dr. King lived in a time where Black people were perceived as less intelligent, um, less informed, and he was a man that spoke very well, that dressed very well, and and this against my personal opinion, the idea of what it means to be Black kind of changes from I don't want to say maybe from generation, but throughout time, it seems like it evolves a little bit, and sometimes people aren't accepted just based off that. There's you're not Black enough because you don't do this. You're not Black enough because you don't do that. I wear a lot of Nikes and Jordans, but maybe Dr. King wouldn't have, suit and tie, and that's all right. But I dress how I dress, and so I'm just wondering what does that look like in today's society? Like how do you think it would be accepted? Would he have been considered black enough? I'm wondering and curious at your thoughts on that.
So I want to level set a little bit before answering the question, because the idea of blackness um, depends on who you're asking. And so, so from a blackness perspective, there's not one monolithic blackness and or one definition. And I think there's a danger in kind of saying that there's this one way to be black. And so the idea of blackness has kind of morphed into kind of these two extremes in my mind. One where it's there's a caricaturized version of blackness that you see on TV and in movies and all that stuff that reinforces all the stereotypes about who black people are supposed to be. You see it in music videos, you see it in everything that we get exposed to. That is not blackness. That is what Hollywood and the music industry and other folks are willing to paint a picture of what blackness is, which is a very limited two-dimensional perspective. I'd probably say it's more one-dimensional perspective of who we are, and that and therefore it perpetuates this idea that there's one blackness. And so I just wanted to explicitly say that. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have kind of blackness framed as kind of within the Black community, as kind of when we've internalized these ideas about what blackness is supposed to be, then it means that we're then limiting other Black people and how they can be in the world. And so part of that is, if you quote unquote, to use some language used earlier, speak well, right, then somehow you're not Black enough, right? That's not a Black concept. That's a internalization of how white people see us, and then therefore what we expect from other Black people. Like, that's not our culture.
Right.
And I just want to be explicit about that, and to say that there are some underlying principles and values that you can see across time across different Black communities, because we have different Black communities.
Right.
And being able to see that pattern, there's some kind of consistency about kind of how you show up in other people's space, right? About how you acknowledge each other and greet each other and really see each other. That's what the head nod's about, right? Like, so that I'm acknowledging that I see you. It's not just to say hi, right? Like, there's logic behind why we do certain things that I think has been lost over time. And I think, and then on top of that, those kind of like consistent things that you see across Black cultures, because there's different ones, that there's also, when we think about MLK, that in present day society, I think he would still be received, not as broadly, right? And so there's some, I think, we live in a different era. There's social media. Um, there's less. I'd probably say today you feel it more, but I think there has been a sense within across Black communities, that things aren't as bad as they could be. Like, for a while we too were kind of lulled into a certain sense of like
False
false
security.
comfort, right? And then, all of these things started happening publicly. And then it was like, a reminder, right? Some of us have experiences more than others with kind of like the day-to-day interactions that remind you about what society thinks you are, and how it tries to limit us in our possibilities. But then also, there are many folks who are Black who didn't necessarily have those experiences all the time. The reason that's important to this conversation about MLK is because during his time, it was clear to everybody that we were in trouble. And problem. And we need to be taking action every day, all the time. And it wasn't just, it wasn't about, um, or let me reframe. It wasn't limited to kind of showing up at a march, right? It wasn't limited to kind of writing letters from, a CEO saying that they support civil rights, right? It was there that Black people and accomplices came together. They had to practice. They were clear about what they were trying to accomplish. They had to practice it. There was a sense of urgency in what was happening, and I think there was a level of strategy that cut across multiple levels of action. And I think kind of present day, where we have the urgency is there, right? The people wanting to go out in the streets and protest is there, and I think being clear about the strategy, right? All of the different actions that it takes. People were in organizations, black people in organizations who were like kind of making sure that certain information got to certain people. There was all types of things happening behind the scenes during this whole movement that are not part of the narrative of what was happening during the civil rights movement, that I think are important for today. And I think uh, if he was with us today, would be challenging for folks, because I think we've also gotten to a place where we're in a society, and then the best way to describe it is almost like a microwave society, right? Like we want everything now, like yesterday, right? I can order my stuff today and it will show up at my door tomorrow. I
Magic.
can microwave stuff and what used to take a couple hours can take 20-30 minutes. What took 20-30 minutes can be done in 1 to 3 minutes. And so everything we want, things to happen a lot faster, and then you have social media on top of that. And I can only imagine what would have been said about MLK in terms of some of the missteps he made in his life, because he was a human being, in terms of what was happening with kind of the adultery, and his change, his evolution in thinking, right? Like if social media was around back then, I think it would have people would have been leveraging the opportunity to kind of call him out, and like all these other things. And then the last thing I'm going to say is, because we've arrived at a place where it feels like, for we've gotten into a pattern that if you're not perfect, then you can't contribute. You can't lead anything. And that's problematic, because it means that we're quick to throw people away when they make a mistake. Whereas in lots of other communities, you can make a mistake and people will rally around you still and defend you and all these other things. And I see a pattern of us being quicker to throw people away when they make a mistake. And I think social media amplifies a lot of the mistakes that we make, and which takes away from our humanity. And then the last thing I'll say is, at the other end of the spectrum is when we deify people in the ways that we deify folks over history. It makes it harder to have conversations about their humanity, right? Because then that becomes another layer of dehumanization, because they were perfect, and therefore you can't say anything. And I think we were joking um, uh, in a conversation maybe last week, and talking about that scene in Barbershop where like someone is saying something about Martin Luther King Jr. and they're like, "You better not say nothing about my Martin Luther King Jr." Right? And so it's like but what it means is like it makes it harder to learn about their humanness and their journey and all those pieces. So I see that whole continuum of opportunity and challenge.
Right. No, thank you very much for that insight. It's funny you said it, because a lot of people, like you said, that we deify. I'm a sports guy, so I'm going to use them as an example. Tiger Woods, Michael Jordan, Kobe Bryant, they all had different issues with their own, kind of demons. Michael Jordan had a gambling problem. Uh, Tiger Woods with his infidelity, same thing with Kobe. And, we had made them these such big figures that we forgot that at the end of the day, they are humans and they make mistakes. And unfortunately, I feel like it's kind of human nature that when somebody else that's polarizing makes a mistake like that, we use that as almost like a defense mechanism. It was like, see, like don't look what I'm doing, but you see them over there, you see what they got some stuff going on, and that almost in turns make us almost, I don't know, feel better about ourselves maybe because the spotlight isn't on us and what we got going on. So I really appreciate you bringing that up. Like, yeah, they were great at what they do, and they're still great at the how they set others up to be successful, but they also had their own faults because at the end of the day, we're just flesh and blood, skin and bones. So nobody's perfect, and I think that's something that needs to be remembered so that people aren't so quick to just judge off of something that happens. So again,
And and I think for to close this part of the conversation out, it also matters how we own our mistakes, right?
mm,
So like in order to when folks are own that they have made a mistake, and but they genuinely atone. And I don't mean kind of the fake apology of, sorry if anyone took my words, or so sorry if someone was offended by it. That's not an apology. And it's not owning the fact that you did something that was harmful to other people. And being able to kind of ensure that that's part of the conversation. So I'm not saying that we should just all willy-nilly just forgive everybody when they make a mistake, but that when people atone and when people own their stuff and they're clear about how they're going to put strategies in to avoid doing that thing again or whatever, that then facilitates the pathway to reconciliation for us to not just throw people away because they made a mistake, especially or mainly when they atone and own their stuff. So just wanted to be explicit about that.
I love it. Y'all heard it here first. Own your stuff. Copyrighted right here on Intentionally Act Live with Dr. Martin.
That's
So
the official terminology.
moving right on. What does MLK's legacy mean for advancing racial equity in 2021? As everybody knows, we deal in racial equity and inclusion and justice in the workplace. How has his work impacted what we do as a group, as a company, and how does it affect your own life here in 2021?
So I would say a few things there. So number one, um, this idea that the vision that MLK had in his later years, and Jada Lattimore had posted earlier on LinkedIn, that it was him, MLK, meeting with other folks like Honorable Elijah Muhammad, that kind of evolved his thinking. And I think also he spent some time really looking at um, what are what he was willing to admit that maybe this wasn't what he thought it was going to be,
Mm,
right? And I think and that gets to owning our mistakes, or and it's in mistakes, we tend to frame them as like something's wrong with you when you make a mistake, but mistakes are places of learning if we allow them to be. The only time it should define and create problems for us is when we don't own our mistakes, right? Because and then we defend them, um, you know practically violently defend mistakes that are unjustified, and that there it really is no logic for. Um, and so the fact that he kind of was able to be honest with himself first, that what he originally envisioned was kind of a naive perspective, and that he evolved and grew to this piece around understanding that racism is how pervasive racism is and how it impacts the North and the South. And you've seen the interviews where he's struggling with the fact that, in the South it's easier to see racism, like you can see it. There's still like this very obvious segregation, and people are getting lynched and all of these things. And not to say it wasn't happening up north, just not in the same style. It wasn't an event in the same way as it was down south. And you see him struggling with that compared to what was happening up north, which was, you see the same kind of impacts of, the segregation, not being able to build wealth, not being able to access, and part of not being able to build wealth is not being able to access good jobs and income, being locked out of unions, and kind of the lack of quality education and all those pieces. So they're getting the same impacts up north. The behavior and the thinking and actions that are leading to those outcomes were more subtle.
Right, right.
So if you fast forward to now, you see the same, you see the same dynamic, but then versus now, right? Like we think of back then, there everything being so obvious and visual, and it was clear. And you look at now, and it's more nuanced and subtle, and you have a lot of Black people who are struggling with even every day with understanding and interaction. Like, was that because I'm Black, or was that, like, what was that about? And so it's more subtle, right? You can't just be like, that was the thing. And so that's important to our work at All Aces, because I think when we're talking about how you advance racial equity, number one, he started with himself, and he was able to have a certain kind of relationship with himself that allowed him to evolve and grow and get on national TV and declare that he had evolved and grew, and said that out loud. And the fact that he was able to see that there were some structural changes that needed to happen with education, with um, access to jobs, and other wealth building opportunities like purchasing homes and things like that. So all of that, that those principles and values that he displayed are important to the work we do at All Aces Inc. in terms of our framing of how we talk about diversity, inclusion, and equity transformations. I also um, uh, have seen, when it comes to like my own life, um, I as I learned more about Martin Luther King Jr. and what he went through, and what how he influenced everything in ways that I think even ways that we don't usually talk about. But I think for me personally, like his respect of being an expert, right? Like he knew you can't get up in front of a room full of people and just say stuff, right? Like you need to know your facts. You need to understand how things work. You need to um, put in the effort it takes to be respectful of the complexity of the reality, and that we're talking about real people's lives, and you can't freestyle. You can't guess at it. You actually have to study. And again, I don't mean like through school, because most of the things he was talking about, he didn't learn in school.
Right. Learn from real life experiences.
He learned from life experience, but also studying. He talked to people, he had kind of a pulse on what was happening across different types of Black people. There's no one Black people, right? And so you have to understand, okay, what's happening in rural, in Black communities, what's happening in Black communities that are starting to evolve in terms of Black immigrants who are coming in, what's happening with kind of the bourgeoisie Black people, like middle class. There's like all of these different dynamics and realities that are playing out, all with this thread of racism being a real thing that is impacting all of those lives in different ways. And so he was committed to the craft of change and movement building and evolution. And that for me is really powerful, because I see a lot of people jump out there and want to do work on things, but don't want to put in the preparation that allows you to do things well, right? So like I see, I've seen folks get up in front of a crowd and like throw out stats that actually weren't true. Like, I don't know where they got those numbers from. Maybe they misremembered them. I don't know. I've also seen, people say, well, because I'm a Black person, or because I'm a person of color, that somehow I am automatically an expert on these issues. And in and I've had people call me in from a mentorship perspective, and say those kind of things to me. And then what I say to them is, well, if you have a car and you drive your car every day,
Mm-hmm.
you wash your car, sometimes you put air in your tires, does that make you an expert on cars?
Nope. It does not certify you as a mechanic. It does not.
And so, because we're having certain experiences, we need to study to understand, well, there are people who thought of this stuff before. There are people who study this before, people who look like us and people who don't look like us. And they have built a foundation for us to stand on. And if you don't study, and if you don't look at any of that stuff, you think that some of the ideas that you're coming up with are brand new. And, look at this thing that I created, when in fact, there are folks who already thought about it and have said, you know what, that's actually not a good idea, because, and here's why. Here's the evidence as to why. And so I'll land here by saying there's a certain thing that desire that we have to want to be engaged, to want to be involved, and we all should. And there's a role for everyone. And if we decide we want to get in front of people and lead them and do any of that stuff, or in that, we need to own that power and responsibility. And that means you have to know what you're talking about. You have to study. And I don't mean you have to be a historian or know everything, but you need to know, like, for this thing that you're advocating for, that you're trying to be an expert in, that what the foundations were before you showed up, and why certain things didn't work or worked, and being able to incorporate all of that. Learning is an important part of being a leader in social justice work and racial equity work, whether it's out in the community or whether it's in an organization. And so I'll stop there.
No, thank you very much. Life lessons and life goals. I appreciate that, and I'm hoping that our watchers and viewers are really soaking this in, because I'm a huge advocate for education. And um, when you understand a problem, you can actually learn how to solve the problem. But if you don't, understand, you're not educated, you just kind of spin your wheels and you go round and round. So thank you very much. Um, so, question about civil rights and what's really changed, and has anything changed? You alluded to earlier in saying that um, there was changes had been made, and some of them subtle, some of them not so subtle, and then there's areas that not much has really changed.
Mhm.
Um, could you go in a little bit more depth about that? And I'm asking kind of on a personal level, because I'm kind of new, and this might shock some people, because a lot of people think that, oh, you're a Black person, so you know what's going on, and you have an idea of what all the stuff is.
Mhm.
The truth is, I'm fairly new to this. I'm going to be completely open and transparent, and I'm learning a lot just in kind of my first year. So, in you've been doing this work for a long time. What are some of the things that have not gotten better? Quite frankly, just
Mhm.
being transparent with that. What's some of the things? And I'm going to use the example of what happened at our nation's capital, not that long ago. Um, for me personally, that's one of the things that I was like, whoa, like what, have we gotten better? Like what's happening? Could you speak to that?
Yes. So there's a couple of things. I want to close out the last conversation. I forgot to say something I think is uh, important around the idea that because we're BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, or people of color, that we're somehow experts. And we're experts on our own experience and what we've been through.
Yeah.
Um, but that study's required. And the reason that's so important is because I've seen a pattern in the diversity, equity, inclusion world where there's a very bright, promising, person of color, Black, Indigenous, whoever, usually a person of color who gets put in those positions because they're a person of color. And
Hmm.
in what gets lost in that is not just the study part, but that when we are modeling our leadership on current um, oppressive models of leadership, it is by default we begin to replicate creating environments that are oppressive without meaning to do so, right? And so the concrete example is you'll see in a lot of organizations a DEI person is in charge of doing the work. They go into a office and they write up an amazing DEI plan and strategy, and it might be great on paper, but whenever you take people's voice and choice away from them as part of process, something as important as how we as an organization are going to address racial equity and other social injustices, um, that's a community process because everybody needs to play a role in it. And so that's a concrete example of in how in leadership we think we have to have all the answers and we have to kind of do all the stuff when in fact we get the best output and results and more in things that are more likely to be implemented when we go through the hard and messy process of kind of collaboration. And so that's a concrete example of like how it can play out when we haven't done the study, when we haven't been groomed for thinking about alternative models of leadership and coaching people. And then to your question about kind of you know what has changed. What I will say is that there's a there's a layer of racism that is built. Well, I should say all of the layers of racism are built on top of our human dysfunction.
Mm. Could
Um, And so our child how we've been socialized just as people, what we've been taught about what a valuable relationship is, right? And if you think that relationships are about getting what you want out of the situation, which is very exploitive and transactional, then you're perpetuating inequities and oppression in those relationships, whether it's a personal relationship, whether it's professional or in an organization. And so that then you layer racism on top of those personal dysfunctions. And then if you're in an organization, you layer the organizational dysfunction on with the in people dysfunction with racism and other forms of oppression. And all of that to say that you can't legislate that. So what we did with the Civil Rights Act is we said, you're not allowed to do these things. And what happened without the change of the narrative, without the change of people's ways of thinking about things, how we framed what racism was, how it works. Um, what happened was a lot of those overt attitudes went underground, right? And so, well, now we know that in public, it's not okay to think a certain way reframe, to say certain things or do certain things in different contexts. But the actual root causes of the racial injustices that we experience systemically, structurally, um, are the ideas that about who people of color are supposed to be, especially Black people and Indigenous people in this society. Oh, and then you also layer in the ideas about well, who white people are supposed to be, and so in that there's a spectrum, and that at the ends of those spectrums are kind of like you have to stay over there, white people, in terms of like you're normal, and so as a normal person, you're supposed to do these things. And then for us, we're supposed to be over here. You other people, you're supposed to be over here, and these are the things that you're supposed to do. And then there'll be some exceptions if you consciously or unconsciously buy into these ideas of normalcy, then we might, you might be able to move a little over on the spectrum and get some of the crumbs of, benefits of white privilege. And that in white people are also only getting some crumbs. The average white person is only getting crumbs of white privilege benefits in the larger context of things. When you think about 1% versus the uh,
Right.
everybody else. But I won't digress there. And so in terms of how things have changed is that we've gotten rid we had reached a point in our society where we had kind of broken down a lot of the kind of what was socially acceptable, but the underlying thinking didn't change. And the idea that we as individuals, everyone has a responsibility for how they make decisions, how they engage with other people when we're in organizations, that we decide on the policies and the practices and the culture of those organizations, that there are people who make policies and there are people who elect other folks to go into positions. Political positions and offices, and so with that reality, we didn't really evolve ourselves at all. The fundamental thinking and ideas about who people are supposed to be never changed. We changed laws. And so you can, and what happens when you change laws? People find ways to get around the laws,
Yep.
right? And so we found ways to get around the laws, and that's what happened. And I want to acknowledge Isabel Garcia, who is sharing with us that there's this whole piece of this attitude around people who think that because they are not part of the group on the obvious receiving end of different types of oppression, in this case racism, that then they don't have a true understanding or they don't own their responsibility in their role in addressing the issues, and that there's a responsibility that we all have um, uh, uh, to do this work and to create the kind of world that we need and that we want. So thank you for that, Isabel. And then Mark Hall also is talking about, and I think this is important to this part of the conversation, this idea of Blackness, right? That there's this caricaturized version of Blackness that we've been taught, and that's what a lot of white people learn about who we're supposed to be. And then when we show up and we're not that thing, or those things, or maybe there's one thing, like maybe someone might like fried chicken, right? Like, but lots of people like fried chicken. But I digress. But and so like, oh, there's a data point that allows me to validate these flawed ideas I have about who you are. And so now all those other things that are completely and totally unrelated are also true about you. And I have my aha, see, I gotcha moment. So you are just like all those other Black people. Like, we're waiting for that confirmation bias to show up. So thank you, Mark, for that, and that we're socialized to believe those things. So I just wanted to acknowledge kind of our folks who are adding to this conversation in very robust ways. So thank you, Mark, and thank you, Isabel.
Yes, thank you very much. And to your point, Dr. Martin, it's funny, as a Black person, I fall into that stereotype sometimes myself with friends of mine. I have a really good friend of mine. His name's Kai, and I always get on him because he's Black and he doesn't like watermelon. I'm like, what? What Black person don't like what? What? But it's still that's unfortunately that's subliminal teachings that, well, if he's Black, by default you're supposed to like A, B, C, and D, and that's just not the case. There is no definition to being Black per se. So I really appreciate that.
And I want to be clear about why that's dangerous. It sounds funny because we're talking about watermelon and fried chicken, but what's dangerous about that is then when I show up at work, my manager sees me as that thing that's not a real person, and I have already been put in a box about what my potential what my potential could be, around how what my possibilities are in the organization based on something they've been taught that is false instead of me having the opportunity to prove myself. I've
Right.
already been discounted. That's the danger of the ideas. The danger of the ideas is that then we see whole communities that way and we
Hmm.
make decisions about who what communities deserve or don't deserve. You know, we make decisions even within communities of color, you know, within the Black community, our communities, about you know, how a Black person is supposed to be and not supposed to be, and usually based on a measure of whiteness. And so, in one of the things I'll explicitly call out, which is one of my pet peeves, as we get down to the to close to the end of the hour, is you know being called white, or you're trying to be white because you're not using slang all the time. Um, and so my daughter had this issue in school. So my youngest daughter will be 13. And last year, another student said, you know, sometimes you talk white. And she said, well, what does a white person talk like? She was like, you know, because we have these conversations all the time at home. And so it was, you know, my family has been here for centuries. English is the language of the land. Why do I not have the right to have ownership of a language?
Hmm.
For generations, my family has been speaking. And if I want to, I can also speak in ways that are, you know, more slang, right? And that are kind of the shorthand things that we say to each other that every different type of culture has, in order to communicate with each other, right? I can do both. I can only do one if I want to. Um,
Right.
who I am and how I decide to be is not something that takes away from me being Black and me caring about Black people and Black issues. So I just want to reinforce that as well, because it's something that I hear a lot. And it's
Hmm.
still replicating itself even with my daughter. When I was in school, that was a thing. She's in school and she's still dealing with the same silly kind of ways of thinking that basically say that white people have a monopoly on excellence, white people have a monopoly on English, and white people have a monopoly on success, white people have a monopoly on fill in the blank, and therefore you as a Black person doing certain things is considered weird and something's wrong with you, and that's problematic.
Preach. You know, I wish, I wish was able to have these types of conversations when I was young, because, as I say, there's nothing new under the sun. And I had the same issues going on in high school because, you know, I didn't do. I ended up playing more sports just so I could fit in and be more Black, because that's what Black people do, quote unquote. We play sports, you know. So thank you for that clarity. We got about 4 minutes left. Um, I just, before we close out intentionally, I do want to ask one more questions. One more question, excuse me, and a quick kind of elevator pitch. What is it that you would like to see come out of the work that you do with All Laces, and just in general, because you're not just you know, CEO of All Laces, but you do so many other things. What was your legacy like to be, if you would?
How you gonna hit me with that kind of question like that? With like three
Because
minutes left. All
you're a
right.
facilitator,
So
you got it.
the shortest way I can say that is it is my hope that through all of the different ways that I have connected parts of my life together to be aligned with my personal mission and my personal values and my personal vision, um, is that folks are able to see that even though I have a personal value, a set of personal values, a personal mission, a personal vision. Number one, that it's they're the kind of things that are respectful of the fact that we're interconnected. It's not just about Atia or not
Mm-hmm.
just about Atia's family. And that being said, that interconnectedness brings me to this idea that we're all struggling with this stuff. Me as a Black woman, I'm struggling with this every day, trying to raise 5 Black children. We have two still at home, and it's hard to do that well. And then when you talk about in businesses and in organizations, that organizations own their responsibility in creating the kind of environments that people want to be in. Because let me tell you, if there's an organization that people of color, Black, Indigenous, and other people of color do not want to be in, there's probably an organization that nobody else wants to be in either.
Mm.
So there's some fundamental issues with the organization that are problematic, because what happens is that people, so BIPOC usually experience the dysfunction of other people and organizations disproportionately. And then you layer on top of that, I have my own dysfunction that I'm trying to deal with and manage, right? So I have
Right.
to deal with
Forgive.
everybody else's dysfunction, right? While I'm trying to like make myself a better person. And so that folks are able to own their power and responsibility, whether it's in an organization, as a person, and that in every situation, no matter how dire it seems, there's always some action that can be taken. Sometimes it's walking away. Sometimes it's quiet resistance. You know, there's a breadth of ways that we can take action. And for my legacy, and what I hope to leave in this world, and for my family, and for others, is that we're able to kind of uncover that invisible power that we have, make it visible, and put it into practice and action. Because it's not just important to advancing racial equity and social justice; it's important to um, our ability to grow and evolve and develop as human beings. Period. End of story. The things that contribute to us being better parents, better leaders, better spouses, significant others, all of those things. They're 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 all connected.
Thank you so much. So eloquently put, as always. Uh, it has been an hour already. I don't know where the time has gone. My goodness. I just want to say, first of all, thank you everybody that's watching, that got to hear all this excellent knowledge and insight from our very own Dr. Atyia Martin. Um, if you guys didn't get a chance, there was a link that flashed at the bottom. Please, please, please visit intentionallyact.com. You can become part of our learning community. You can help transform yourself, your workplace, and our larger culture. Be a part of the solution, not a part of the problem. I would.
You're gonna be mad at me because I have one more thing to add.
You gotta go ahead, man. Look, I'm all for it. You know me. I'm not going anywhere.
So, I keep thinking about Martin Luther King Jr., Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and I think I want to be explicit about his where he was going with his vision.
Mm-hmm.
Um, he saw that there was this complicated web between racism and economic injustices, and that there has been this long history of Black people's struggles being separate from what white people, the kind of poor working class white people were dealing with, and that for us we have to deal with racism, what it is, how it works, all those pieces. And part of the hustle is that it creates separation across shared struggles. And so I'm not able to see in your poor white working class struggle my struggle as a poor Black working class person, right? And that there's as long as we're fighting with each other, then we miss the fact that all the real resources and kind of action that's happening is more on the kind of 1%, 10% side of the house. And that as long as we're distracted fighting over
Right.
crumbs, then these things continue to fester and perpetuate, and there's incentives to keep us separated in that way. So I just wanted to be explicit about that because I didn't say it earlier. So thank you, Stephen, for your leadership and coming up with the idea for this episode and hosting it. And I just really appreciate you and appreciate all of the folks who are on. Jenny and Azaz and Pierre, thank you so much for joining us today. Kevin, always a pleasure to see you. Mr. Shanley, and I'm going to now really be quiet this time.
No, you're good. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. I love all of y'all. Just keep in mind with the times that we're in, remember Dr. MLK's message, peace and unity. And last but not least, before I let everybody go, be safe, stay healthy, check on your loved ones, You know, you never know when they won't be here. It's a stressful time for everybody. Make sure you take care of yourself. Collective care, y'all. It's a real thing. Utilize it all the time. Tell your friends about it. Tell your family. Love y'all. Y'all be safe. We'll see you next time.